Hello and welcome back to Medical Compliance with Clarissa. I'm Clarissa Benfield, our Global Director and Business Line Leader for our medical and laboratory business here at Intertek. And today I am so excited to be joined by Matt Quinn, Director from our Intertek Assuris group, for your second time back on the podcast. Thank you so much for joining today, Matt.
Thanks for having me, Clarissa. Good to be back.
Yeah, happy to have you. So for anyone who missed it, Matt was on our episode number 5, where we talked about hazardous chemicals and compliance. So if you're interested in that topic, definitely go back and check it out. But today we're going to be talking about another kind of new, exciting, I guess, hot topic, we could call it, right? Something that's coming up more and more that people are talking about, which are PFAS, right? So something that we hear this phrase kind of going around a lot. And I think, there's a bit of maybe lack of clarity for some people. So excited to dive into that today. So maybe you can just start us off, Matt, by explaining a little bit of, what PFAS is, how is it used, throughout day to day?
Sure. Yeah. So PFAS is literally in everything we use. So you can look around your house or your room or your office space, and you'll find it in different applications. The most widely used that consumers would think of is things in like food contact packaging, to make sure that the packaging doesn't absorb the oil and things that come off your food after you order it for takeout, which we all do abundantly now. Another application, which I know as a parent, which I value highly, is Scotchgard on furniture and things, right? As sort of like a grease and water repellent. So those are sort of the common areas, but there's something like 10,000 different variants of the substance itself. So when we start talking about regulations and things, people understand just how complex this situation is. And they're not all created equal, to be completely honest with you, which adds another complexity to all of this. So when we look at PFAS, it has a number of different uses, but it's really there from a repellent type of thing. Yeah. So think of medical devices, so it's using catheters and other types of things to make sure there's no clotting of blood in them and all that sort of thing as well. So that's sort of, when we think about PFAS, that's really where we're at, and sort of the use of it is to make sure that it's repelling certain things and materials that are harmful to it, or affect the quality of that product or the material or whatever it's intended to do.
Well, and so as you say, right, it's around us everywhere. So everywhere that we are, in our home environments, in our work environments, in our day-to-day environment. So why is, as an individual living human being on this earth, why is PFAS a concern for people, right? Why is this something that's coming up as something to be concerned about?
Yeah, so for the ones that are toxic, there's a term that's being floated around as it's a forever chemical, right? And a lot of people don't really understand what that means. But essentially what it is that it doesn't degrade or dissolve in environment, in water, in our bodies. So it just sits there and it continues to leach out or create toxic environments. So again, they're not all created equal, but the ones that are fairly commonly used, that are toxic, have that sort of forever nature of it, and they never go away, where some other ones eventually dissolve or get absorbed by the environment that they're sitting in. So some of those things, from a PFAS perspective, being forever, they're sort of there and causing the different adversities and things that they provide, not only from an exposure from a human element, but also from an environment side of things. When you start looking at drinking water, and air and soil and all those things as well. So it really has longing effects on it. Again, not everything is created equal, but that's the biggest concern around PFAS, is that sort of idea that it is a forever chemical, and it's not going to go away as it sits in landfills or in water sources and all those sort of things as well.
Yeah, and I think that phrase is really interesting to think about, right? Especially when we see that, manufacturers, consumers, right? Everyone is concerned about toxic chemicals and toxic environment, right? And what are we subjecting ourselves to? I think drinking water is a great example, right? I mean, people are concerned, like, what is leaching into our water? What are you ingesting every day? And then this idea of something as a forever chemical that doesn't go away, that is always going to be there, that could potentially always be toxic in some way, I think is important for people who are manufacturing devices, but also just, as an individual consumer, you want to know, okay, where are these substances coming into my day-to-day life? So you gave some examples, right? I think from the fast food example is great, right? And just, it really could be found anywhere in your day-to-day, but I want to dive a little bit more into some of the medical examples specifically. So where do we see these chemicals, PFAS, commonly in med devices, when we're looking at the medical or laboratory industry specifically?
Sure. Yeah. So where we're seeing it, I'll say like a lot of like implants, right? So stuff that where you need blood or fluid to be flowing through it. It's there to sort of keep that non-friction or that non-clogging sort of mentality of it. So things like catheters, other sort of like stents and those sort of things of applications are there. But we also find it in electronic equipment, like on like printed circuit boards. They use it to sort of keep moisture and things off of the circuitry and all those sort of things as well. I think they were often found in like ventilators and like COVID-19 kits and stuff when we start thinking of more recent applications for them. And that causes an issue because when we start looking at medical device manufacturers, and you guys are already, or they are already, heavily regulated. We start looking at things like EU MDR, where you have to look at like over 2,000 substances from a PBT perspective. And now they start regulating PFAS, which is used in the medical device industry to make sure that those devices continue to work as safely as they possibly can and don't cause further issues with it. Now we're starting to get into, okay, what's the payoff from regulating this substance versus keeping it in, and what is it providing from a safety and quality perspective? So not only, unfortunately, for medical device manufacturers, you're heavily regulated, you're used to doing this, but this particular piece is different than, say, BPA was another sort of highly visible regulated substance that they brought in, which has very similar things in the sense that there was really no hard evidence that BPA like harmed people at the level that they were claiming that it did. But because it was so well known and so well publicized, they couldn't do anything but look at regulating it. And then things like the Ross regulation, they had an exemption for medical devices for a number of years there and sort of grandfathered them in. The REACH regulation, they were there. So it falls in line with a lot of the other regulations we're seeing. But the problem we're having here is there's about 10,000 variants of it. And how and where they're used can be very widespread. So it's luckily for some of the regulations that are coming in, I'm sure we're going to get to that in a second, a lot of the wording around is intentionally added. So from a medical device perspective, in the application of PFAS, the intentionally added part could help in terms of the complexity of compliance, but it's still going to be a fairly large undertaking just because of how and where it's used across the board of materials, electronics, mechanical items, all those sort of things. It's just so widely used, and there's such a bucket of substances to worry about. It is going to cause fairly high complexity there.
Yeah, and I think it's interesting too, because when we look at this kind of evolution over time with medical devices and the regulations for specifically for some of these chemicals and at a component rate level, applying but giving the exemption, right? Because a lot of times with medical devices, right, there may be no other way to accomplish what you're trying to accomplish, right? And so the benefit is greater than the risk, which is, okay, if someone needs to be on a ventilator, what's your other option, right? So when you're looking at it in terms of, okay, well, perhaps there is an exemption, or same thing we were looking at, x-ray equipment and, leaded, right? And that has to be added just because of what the technology is and how you actually employ it.
Absolutely. Yep.
Yeah. Yep. So when we get into these PFAS specifically, what are we seeing from the regulations? I know you kind of mentioned it. Is this going to be regulated separately like an ROHS or REACH or WE, or is this going to be industry by industry? Or is this just going to be an overwhelming regulation? Like, what are we seeing kind of so far in the marketplace?
Sure. So the downside to this right now in North America, in US in particular, it looks like it's being regulated at a state level, which sucks. There's no other way of putting it, because you're going to have varying levels of requirements. And what we ran into earlier this year was the state of Maine had a reporting requirement due, I think it was in January, February this year. But they didn't really understand what they were asking companies to disclose. So sort of at the last minute, they put this exemption letter out where you could essentially fill it in and submit it, and you're exempt from reporting for the year because they really didn't know what they were asking for. We've seen the state of California restricted in things like food packaging and textiles and things. So not necessarily directly affected to medical devices specifically. And I think that'll probably hold true from a North American perspective, because we tend to look at more of the consumer side of things. Not that all medical devices are commercial, but they tend to lean towards the non-consumer side. And in Europe, we're still going through it. So they've proposed a regulation around the restriction of PFAS. They just released a statement, I think earlier, maybe late last month, earlier this month, so last week, around the consultation period of it. And there was something around over 5,600 comments were made. So you know that companies and industries are taking this very seriously and trying to if there is going to be a regulation, at least lobby for the different industries to be exempted. Very similar to what you mentioned. It's one thing to regulate something, but if we don't have the technology to properly replace that regulation or what they're restricting, then that does us all a disservice, particularly in the medical device field, because we know that's critical to our well-being. So I think we'll see further adoptions to that regulation. And I think we're going to probably see a scope exemption list in terms of they'll sort of grandfather different industries in. I wouldn't be surprised if we see something similar to ROHS, where they release sort of a sub list of products that are under scope, or at least a sub list of substances that are under scope. And then those scopes will grow as the years go on, or they'll have timelines, and they'll reassess at those timelines for those particular exempted products or industries. So we'll see what it looks like. The problem is it's very Wild West right now. So where we're seeing companies move to or the regulations move to, is they don't have set limits either. So, we ran into this with BPA a little bit, where it could be parts per billion, which is a much higher detection limit. And much more difficult to detect. You have to have the right testing things, and we can't necessarily test every material and stuff in there. So one of the issues we have is the huge substance list, but also what are going to be the limits that companies have to adhere to. And we're starting to see a little bit of that. I think the state of California used some limits for their food packaging or their textile restriction they put in. We'll see what the PFAS and regulation in the EU will emit from their requirements, but that piece of it will also be a key factor of, okay, how do we actually figure out, and how do we know if they're there? Because identifying and proving are two very different things when we start from a compliance perspective. So like I said, there's a lot of moving parts here. I think for the most part, when we look at electronic space, we're still waiting for sort of the big domino to drop, and we should see some other requirements follow suit. I think the main one will be in Europe. I think state levels will address it at a specific level, food packaging or packaging being number one. And then we're seeing things like artificial turf and other aspects fall under some of these state level ones as well, which wouldn't play into medical devices. So we're still waiting, but there are, some varying levels there that we want to keep an eye on to understand sort of what the impacts are.
Yeah. So with that too, I mean, I think it is really interesting where we are. And obviously we've gone through all of these things again with RHS, with REACH, with going through this idea of, hey, there's all of these harmful substances out there. What are we doing? How are we identifying them? How are we categorizing them? How do we say, which types of products it applies to? But from a manufacturer's perspective, right? Like what are we doing today? What should we be doing today? Is it the same thing? Are you asking a supplier, hey, I need to understand if you have PFAS in your materials? Like, what should you be doing in this moment to be doing your due diligence or preparing for the likelihood of some sort of regulation from an EU perspective or to meet state requirements? What is the manufacturer intended to be doing?
Sure. So we're seeing a lot of manufacturers just simply surveying their supply chain right now and trying to gather as much information as they can around the use of PFAS, particularly with like the intentionally added verbiage that's being used. They should know if that's being used within the material, if it's being intentionally added. Obviously, the suppliers are the ones that are providing the raw materials or the assemblies or whatever they're using from a finished product perspective. So we see a lot of companies that are surveying their supply chain just on do you know if PFAS is used in the materials that we're sourcing? So they're kind of creating a hierarchy of a risk-based approach of what does our suppliers actually know about PFAS? Because when you start looking at the uses of PFAS and the size of the list that's in there, doing a material risk assessment up front can be quite difficult because of the different substances and how they're used. So you're kind of creating a risk based of, okay, what does my supply chain know about PFAS, and is it being used, and what can they tell me about the substances that they know are being used, right? That's the starting point. Other areas we're seeing, I'll say, less complex manufacturers. So maybe more mechanical side or packaging manufacturers. A lot of the requirements will probably see a screening of being able to test for total organic fluorine. So it's like the F in there of PFAS is the sort of fluorinated substances. So we can test for fluorine. You can't have PFAS without that in there. So what that'll tell you is if you have a hit on fluorine, then there's a possibility that you have PFAS within your product. So it's sort of another gate that we can use, particularly once we've done some supplier outreach and we start looking at what those materials are, and we can do a little bit more of an educated guess of where it could or couldn't be. Then we can use that fluorine testing of saying, okay, if it's not there, then we know PFAS is most likely there, not likely there. I'm not going to say definitively not, because we talked about it.
But as a way to kind of start the ruling out process. Yeah.
That's right. Yeah. So you can kind of, again, there's not a distinct process, but you can kind of start logically going through some of it. There's just certain things that you're probably going to have to wait and see what comes out from a regulation side of things. But that's what we're really in the sort of information gathering stage from an overall compliance perspective. Until something drops and there's a limit, there's not a whole lot you can do in terms of understanding and moving towards a compliance state.
Yeah, I think it's going to be really interesting to see what happens. I mean, all good things, right? All intended to keep people healthier and safer, right? So just how it's going to be implemented and how, we take it from a testing perspective versus taking it from a manufacturer's perspective, right? And how this kind of shapes up and moves forward, especially as we look at some of these technologies and try to determine, okay, what's going to be the best option, that you're getting the treatment that you need, or you're getting what you need in your day-to-day life in the safest way possible, right? So I think it'll be quite interesting over the next, months and years to see what comes next.
Yeah, it is complex. And like I said at the beginning, like not all PFAS are created equal. So, we're hoping that the regulators are taking a common sense approach here and taking those, I think it was like 5,600 and change comments, if I read the article correctly, of really taking those into account of what are things that were potentially, again, that weight of costs of regulating versus keeping it in, and really taking that into account before we just sort of broad brush all this, because I think there are certainly applications there that they need to be regulated and restricted in, absolutely. But I think there's certain areas that we just have to take our time and understand sort of, are there alternatives here that are going to provide the same level of quality product that we know? I mean, there's just certain types of products, medical devices being one, that we just, we have to live with, some of the things for the better, right? And that's just the way it is.
So as we're ending here, right, our key kind of takeaway for manufacturers who are starting this process or hearing about PFAS from a medical side and wanting to start doing what they need to be doing. So at the same time as you're looking at all of your substances, gathering all of your information for ROHS and for REACH, you should be asking these questions as well of the people where you're receiving, your suppliers, and say, hey, what do you know about PFAS? Are you using PFAS? And try to start gathering that information now. Absolutely.
Yep. And updating things like procurement and qualification questions. I think even as Intertek, we fill out, supplier questionnaires all the time. That needs to certainly be part of that when we're looking at sourcing material as well from a med device perspective. They usually have it at some level. So just those little things that again, what they've been doing for ROHS and REACH, they can start implementing it from a PFAS perspective to at least start gathering information. So when the ball does drop, that they're not caught flat-footed, that they've got some information ready to go.
Well, perfect. Well, Matt, thank you so much for joining me here for a second time. Great conversation, really interesting topic. If anyone has any questions, of course, they can reach out directly, and we'll be happy to get you connected to the right people internally on our side to talk about all things PFAS, but any of the other chemical challenges or concerns that you're having as well. So thanks so much, Matt.
Thanks, Clarissa.